All right, let's get started. So my name is Dan Rowe. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Tufin. Today we're going to be covering addressing GDPR compliance mandates after the deadline. I know there's been a lot of communications, I think, from all sorts of sources on how to address compliance preparation. But in a series of conversations I had with CISOs and data privacy attorneys, I thought it might be interesting to take a look at how things will be changing after the deadline itself. Today's agenda will include a brief overview of GDPR, a site where some of this information is coming from, and a few of the challenges that are expected after the May 25th deadline. At the end, we'll be including the Q&A section. Some of the things that we're not going to be covering today is a demonstration of Tufin. I think beyond this slide, this is all that we'll be referencing. So if you're curious about our solutions and how they may align to GDPR, you can definitely check out our website. I've also included an attached link to our network security best practices. It's general to network security policy management, but you'll also be able to get some insight on how Tufin may apply to some of these processes that we're going to be talking about today. You can see it just off to the right. And as we go along, if you guys have any questions, please do feel free to enter them off to the right. I'll make sure I get to them in a timely fashion as appropriate or towards the end. We'll also be including a poll as well, which I'll cover at that time. In addition, if you're interested in that link document, it's under attachments and links. So I wanted to include a couple quotes from Elizabeth Denham, who's largely leading the GDPR initiative. We're all going to have to change how we think about data protection, and it really requires a change in mindset itself. And I think really at the heart of it too, it's demonstrating the best of intentions. So a few of these data points are interesting, particularly given the principal guidance that's given, not necessarily technical guidance as well. So knowing that change is afoot and we can't really change it, it's about time for organizations to figure out how they can adapt to it and really optimize their operations to align to GDPR requirements. So I mentioned earlier, we're able to source a couple contacts here that were able to contribute to the content here, but they weren't necessarily comfortable presenting. I thought that was kind of interesting because I think given the novel nature of GDPR and some of the uncertainty associated with it, folks have been a little bit more reticent to disclose, I guess, their identities and aligning their leadership to GDPR, largely because I think it's a wait and see mandate. So see a couple people here, one that was reticent to disclose their identity or publicly comment on this in fear that they might appear on a disgruntled regulator's search. Another one simply because they were concerned that they may end up over-disclosing or over-promoting their compliance baseline. And again, I think it's really considered or in consideration the fact that this is very new. So the real interesting, I guess, theme to GDPR is some of the uncertainty, right? And one of the reasons it's bubbled up to such relevance is that it's a new compliance mandate. And anything that's new obviously requires organizations to think about how they operate and change their processes to align to it. But it's really motivated by the heavy penalties, right? 4% of annual turnover or 20 million euro, whichever one's highest. And those can be pretty stiff. But those are determined through, say, iterations by the enforcement agents, which I believe will largely be law firms at the start of it. But the real challenge here is not necessarily technical guidance, right? In the way that one might be able to ensure compliance with PCI, there's not necessarily that clear plan for GDPR as well. And because of that, organizations are having to consider their processes more holistically and purposefully. There's also a question of viability of accountability. You can think of any number of organizations that retain the data of EU residents and how they might use it, right? Small mom and pop shops that might have an email newsletter going out tracking IP addresses and email addresses that don't necessarily have a high revenue, whereas there's large enterprises that may be collecting quite a bit more information in their processes, generating quite a bit more revenue, and ultimately probably attracting themselves as being a little bit more of an attractive target for determining, we'll say, financial sanctions or penalties associated with noncompliance. Now, I'd like to very quickly launch a poll, which should populate on your screen, really trying to figure out how ready everyone is in terms of their preparation for GDPR compliance. I'll leave it on the screen for about 30 minutes or 45 seconds. And kind of keep going. And I'm also very happy to summarize the results as well. It is an anonymous poll, but kind of a quick straw poll just to get a read. Now, as you guys are completing the voting poll that we've attached to this, I also wanted to point out the perspective that we're going to be talking about GDPR compliance in the context of a post-May 25th deadline. And the conversations that I've had are not necessarily in how organizations are aligning their processes to the new mandate, but how they're anticipating to change their processes shortly after. So first and foremost, I think everyone understands that there's going to be change. And when we say change, it's not necessarily just in line with the processes, but the actual network itself, right? And if we look at what the results of the polls are here, thank you all for filling it out. It looks like we have a handful of folks that are very comfortable with their compliance model. The majority of folks don't think that they'll be fully compliant, but they developed a program to get them there. And about a third that says they may never be ready. And I think that's a very accurate portrayal of the challenges, simply because there's not necessarily that clear path to what success is. So in the context of network changes itself, even if on May 25th, folks are compliant in their operations, that network change process is always going to be fluctuating, right? And there's going to be introductions to the network. And one of the conversations I had was around the launching of a customer portal. So their intention is to launch the application internally June 1st, test it out, and then go through kind of their design process, right? How are we going to introduce connectivity to this application? Are we going to understand what's within this application, or at least the data that has access to, and assess risk? And then we have to make our decision, right? But there's a unique challenge that I think a lot of organizations face, and ensuring that they actually meet the agility requirements of the business, where even if they see something, they may not say something, and they'll just provision it because there's pressures within the business. One CISO I spoke to that said, regardless of really any organization's standpoint, maturity, and policy, they're always going to have something that's non-compliant. And rather than simply accept that and move on and hope nothing comes out of it, it's critically important to document, if not before, now more so than ever before. There's also a lot of consideration about changing the change process itself, right? When we talk about the winds of change coming in means to adjust the sails, it means that we need to make small incremental changes after. Part of this, in the kind of same vein of the well-intentioned or consideration of the business itself, there needs to be a larger collective audience. So sitting in a room full of engineering staff, there's not necessarily purpose or full value in discussing how things are going to be done, but if they're being done in the correct way. And if they can't confidently say yes, they can do it, then they've identified where a change needs to be applied in their process. And of course, harkening back to the prior point, the idea of allowing something that they know to be risking the network without knowing why they did it worries them the most, right? If you've worked very hard to ensure a healthy policy at this, we'll say the snapshot of compliance on May 25th, you don't want to introduce uncertainty or risks within the environment simply because it won't sit well during the auditing process. Another interesting point I heard from a data privacy attorney was, why do we even have to make this decision, right? Organizations focus very, very emphatically on getting applications live and to market. But in kind of the history of organizations really requiring more data and the buzz of the big data narratives, organizations started expanding the data that they're collecting because they can now purpose it. But one data privacy attorney said that he chimed in kind of a provisioning process, or at least review process, and said, well, do we even have to have this data? Do we even have to collect it at all? And what would it actually be the impact of us deleting this data? And it's not something that organizations may have historically considered, but now given the more nebulous nature of what constitute personal data, at least in the context of GDPR, it may be a much more simpler solution prior to activating an application, connectivity, and potentially exposing that data inadvertently to outside parties. There's also the issue of asset identification, right? May 25th, even if the network is up to policy and compliance with GDPR, there's going to be changes. We talked about the new cloud applications that might be launched, public or private, or even within the network itself. But there's a number of different other introductions to the network, right? People are very familiar with shadow IT or Internet of Things, right? There was a recent breach through I believe it was a camera at an aquarium at a casino in Las Vegas. There's also the introduction of shadow IT, employees that would circumvent the approval process and actually use their own kind of applications of those which are publicly accessible, which may also contain public data. This is kind of a nebulous concept to approach, but I did want to bring up a Tufin partner that we think are doing some pretty interesting things around this called Reposify that actually do some scanning along the edge network, try to identify assets that would belong to the company that fit under shadow IT or may sit on the edge network or be introduced within it, and also scans it for vulnerability. So if organizations are in attendance today that are planning or looking at ways to identify the breadth of their network, this might be an interesting solution provider to take a look at, and Tufin does provide an integration with it. So another interesting point to consider is the data itself. Often, I think the question is, does the data being processed contain, does the data being processed contain the data of EU citizens? And this is actually an incorrect way to look at it. If you speak to a data privacy attorney, we'll quickly point out the objection, right? It's not necessarily citizens, it's residents. And this is a very interesting point of consideration and a unique one at that, because just because if you're focusing on EU citizens that may be living outside the EU itself, it actually needs to be inverted a little bit. You could have foreign nationals living within EU itself, and even if they don't necessarily belong to the EU or as a citizen, they can be a resident there, and their data would be covered under GDPR policy. So that actually required a review of the data that they were currently using in a number of different applications and how they review it, track it, and tag it. There's another piece around corporate citizenship, right? We talked earlier about having that room full of people discussing the change management process and how to do it, but not always a whole lot of consideration around are they doing the right thing. And I think a big part of the struggle that organizations face are navigating internal politics and divides. One CISO mentioned that he believes that everyone's accountable for their individual actions, but really at the core, it's a team effort. And by that, they also have responsibility for the actions of others. So when we discussed identifying gaps in process, I think it's also gaps in ethics, right? And providing the ability of the platform for organizations to actually be able to solicit ideas and solutions from those involved in the change management process to really optimize it. So I wanted to make sure that we had a quick webinar today, which we've been able to do. And I wanted to cover a couple of the key takeaways. Number one, which is the ensuring the documentation of exceptions, right? And there need to be all sorts of facets included here. We talked about the types of data and the understanding of it, and exactly how that can be retrieved for the auditing process. Also, the ability to modify the change process and do so in an adaptive and progressive way. Thirdly, challenge business requirements, right? Part of that is not necessarily the moral or internal perspective on that, but also identify if the actions being undertaken are even necessary out the gate. Fourthly, it's the unknown asset identification and classification, which are really a two-part process, but a critical aspect in the idea of understanding that which is within the corporate network itself and how to be classified. And lastly is encouraging corporate citizenship, a critical facet of any organization, at least in terms of aligning to the more proactive and we'll say ethical approach that GDPR is enforcing. So with that being said, I'm happy to answer any questions that folks have. And one is around Tufen's ability to help with compliance. We do have a number of solutions within that for auditing, change tracking, a policy template that monitors zone-to-zone access. So that way, both risky access can be determined as well as, we'll say, tracked as well and recertified, which is being included in a number of different organizations. But to learn more about that, I'd highly encourage you to visit the website. And in terms of another question, someone asked about recording the webinar. It's on the BrightTalk platform. It should all be available to access this after at any given time. All right. And I think this actually concludes our webinar. We had a good quick one today, and I appreciate you guys chiming in and participating. If you guys have any questions, please do feel free to follow up with us at the Tufen website. Thank you.